Today's story is Mr. Nosey by Roger Hargreaves. Have you got your books ready? Well, if so, let's begin. Mr. Nosey liked to know about everything that was going on. He was poking his nose into other people's business. Mr. Nosey was the sort of person who, if they came upon a locked door, couldn't resist looking through the keyhole to see why the door had been locked. Mr. Nosey was the sort of person who, if he found an unopened letter addressed to somebody else, would simply have to open it to find out what was inside. Mr. Nosey was the sort of person who, if he was sitting reading a paper on the train, would much rather read the paper of the person sitting next to him. Naturally, as you might imagine, Mr. Nosey was not very popular. People did not like the way in which Mr. Nosey would peek and pry into their affairs. They did not like it at all. But did that stop Mr. Nosey peeking and prying? It did not. Mr. Nosey lived in a funny, tall, thin house in a place called Tiddletown. The people in Tiddletown decided that Mr. Nosey was becoming much too nosy, so they held a meeting to discuss what to do about it. "We must find something to stop him from being so nosy," said Mr. Chippy, the town carpenter. "That's right," said Miss Washer, who ran the Tiddletown laundry. "If only we could think of a way to stop him from poking his nose into everything," said Mr. Brush the painter. And then a smile spread across his face. "Listen," he said with a grin. "I have a plan." All the friends gathered round to listen to his plan. The following morning, Mr. Nosey was walking along Tiddletown High Street when he heard something whistle behind a closed door. "Oh, I wonder what that's going to be," he thought to himself, as he tiptoed up to the door quietly to open and peer in. Splash went very wet paint right on Mr. Nosey's nose, covering it in bright red paint. "Oh dear, I'm sorry," said Mr. Brush, who was painting the inside of the door. Poor Mr. Nosey had to go straight home and try to remove the red paint, which was very difficult and rather painful. Mr. Brush chuckled to himself. The plan had begun. The following morning, Mr. Nosey was walking past the laundry when he heard somebody laughing on the other side of the wall. "Oh, I wonder what's going on there," he thought to himself as he stood on his tiptoes to look over the wall. Stop! Went a clothes peg right on the end of Mr. Nosey's nose. "Oh dear, I'm sorry," said Miss Washer, who was hanging up clothes on the washing line on the other side of the wall. Poor Mr. Nosey removed the clothes peg and went off and down the street feeling extremely sorry for himself and for his poor red nose. Miss Washer chuckled to herself. The plan was working. The next day, Mr. Nosey was going past the fence when he heard a hammering. "Oh, I wonder what's going on there," he thought to himself as he creeped very quietly to the end of the fence and peered around. Bang! Went a hammer right on the end of Mr. Nosey's nose. "Oh dear, I'm sorry," said old Mr. Chippy, who was nailing up a loose panel on the fence. Poor Mr. Nosey had to go home immediately and bandage his poor red sore nose. Mr. Chippy's grinned a broad grin. The plan was working very well indeed. The following day, Mr. Nosey was walking in the woods when he heard somebody sawing wood. "Oh, I wonder what's going on there," he thought to himself as he crept up behind the trees. He was just about to peer out from behind the trees when it suddenly occurred to him that if he did, something very nasty might happen to his nose. And so he went on his way through without being nosy. Behind the tree, with a saw raised in his hand, stood Mr. Herd the farmer. When he saw Mr. Nosey had gone on his way without being nosy, he laughed and laughed and laughed. The plan had worked. Mr. Herd hurried into Tintown to tell everybody. The plan really had worked, because after that Mr. Nosey stopped being so nosy and soon became very good friends with everybody in Tiddletown. And that is the end of the story, except to say that if you are ever tempted to be nosy, as Mr. Nosey used to be, you better accept one thing: a sore nose. The end.